Okay, welcome to this week's Halacha Shir. Because Purim, Mitzvah Hashem, is on Friday, that is going to be the topic of our discussion, the Purim Seuda on Friday, at least for those in Chutz La'aretz, or at least outside of Yerushalayim. Purim falling on a Friday is an unusual event. Mitzvah Hashem, the next time it happens is 20 years' time, in 2045, in 5805. So that's a long time off, but it's a very special time. And of course, Yerushalayim has its own particular halachas. What we're going to be focusing on is on the Seuda that Mitzvah Hashem we will be celebrating outside of Yerushalayim, whether that's in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz, this Friday. If you're listening online, please email me and I'll send you the handout, j.golker@gmail.com. So the starting point is generally eating Seudas on Friday. The Shulchan Aruch says in Orach Chaim, in Siman Reish Mem Tes Seif Beis, you're not allowed to have a very large meal that you sort of larger than you would have during the week. You can't have that on Erev Shabbos. That you should enter Shabbos with an appetite, so that you would enjoy your Shabbos meal, and that is part of Oneg Shabbos. And that prohibition extends the entire day. To have a very large meal on a Friday is not allowed in halacha. But to have, a regular meal without being kaveh a massive Seuda, like you would normally do on a regular weekday, that is fine, and you're allowed to start that min hadin. But from 9 hours onwards, later in the afternoon, one should avoid it, because again, it will take away from your enjoyment of the meal on Friday night, and take away from the Oneg Shabbos. And then he carries on, for there is a minhag for those to fast in Erev Shabbos. We've spoken about that in a different shir. That's for another time. Now, just a few ha'aros from the Mishnah Berurah. In Sivkot and Zayin, the Mishnah Berurah says, the Gemara says that there was a family in Yerushalayim. They were kovea Seuda every Friday, every Erev Shabbos, and as a punishment for that, that family was sort of wiped away. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, so telling you the gravity of the situation. Mishnah Berurah Sivkot and Ches Erev Shabbos v'uadin be'erev Yontov. It's not only applicable on Erev Shabbos; it's also true on Erev Yontov. It's the Yontov Nami mitzvah la'on goy. The Pri Megadim says there is a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos and of Oneg Yontov and Kovod Yontov, and therefore one should refrain from overeating on Erev Yontov as well. And then Sivkot and Yud, the Mishnah Berurah says, Kovod HaShabbos, v'yesh shekasu hatam shemetoich tirdas hasuda lo yisasku b'tzorchei Shabbos. Others say a different reason, not because you're going to overeat and therefore not have an appetite for Friday night, but rather you'll be so preoccupied with the meal that you won't be able to be involved in tzorchei Shabbos. Yud Aleph, Mishnah Berurah, sheikonis HaShabbos, she'af she'eichel b'boiker, kiven shu marbe b'sudas. Even if you have a very large meal in the morning, which is way more than you would normally have, shuv le'eichel b'layla l'te'avan, again, that might impact your appetite for the evening. Now, let's talk about Purim. Purim stood on a Friday. So the Shulchan Aruch says, the Ramah says in Hilchas Purim, this is in Siman Tov Reish Sadihei, in Seif Beis, in box number 2. The Ramah says, "Kashechal Purim b'yom shishi." When Purim falls on a Friday, yasu hasuda b'shachris mishum kavod Shabbos. So, when Purim falls on a Friday, you've got a bit of a clash. On one hand, you have Purim, you need to celebrate it, and one of the 4 mitzvahs of the day is, of course, the Mishteh, is the feast, is the Seuda. On the other hand, you've got to balance that with Erev Shabbos, what we've just read, the halacha above, i.e., asalik verb Erev Shabbos Seuda. So you need to balance those things. How do you balance it? Says the Ramah, "Kashechal Purim b'yom shishi yasu hasuda b'shachris mishum kavod Shabbos." Just make the Seuda in the morning. Or misha reitzel asoyis tomid b'shachris harushas biyadei. Quoting the Trumas Hadeshen. So it doesn't have to be just this year when Purim falls on a Friday. If a person wants to make the Seuda in the morning, for whatever reason, he's entitled to do so, and that's what we will do in Mitzvah Hashem this year. It says in Mishnah Berurah, what does Shachris mean? Hainu kaidem chatzos hayoim. That means before chatzos. Before chatzos hayoim, lechatchila Okay, so Chatzos Hayom this year, for example, in London, I wrote down the times. For London, it will be, I think it's 12:07, and therefore one has to try and have the Seuda. Here it is, but sorry, it's 12:10. But before 12:10 in London, and whatever time Chatzos is in whichever community you're in, one should start before Chatzos, which is halachic midday. And like I say, in London this year, that is 12:10 p.m. at lunchtime. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan says, Sudas mitzvah shezmana kavu be'erev Shabbos, next box, kamoi bepurim, shechol be'erev Shabbos, or bris milah. If you have a Sudas mitzvah which falls on a Friday, for example Purim, or for example a bris on a Friday, you're allowed to have a large meal. It's going to take away from your appetite for the Friday night Shabbos meal. Don't worry about it. It says the Aruch HaShulchan ha'isik b'mitzvah potam min mitzvah. If you are actively involved in one mitzvah, then you don't have to worry. You are potter. You're exempt from the second mitzvah. Therefore, if you are involved in the mitzvah of the Purim Seuda, you are exempt from the mitzvah of Einik Shabbos, of enjoying a meal, and therefore one has to balance that as well. But you should try and start the meal earlier so that it minimizes the impact on the Friday night meal. And then he says, before the 10th hour. Now, Shah Asiris is the beginning of the 10th hour, the end of the 9th hour, which is halfway between Chatzos and Shkia. And again, in this year in London, that would be 3:07 p.m. Now, if one missed that, then b'diavad it can be eaten all day. However, the Piskei Tshuva says b'diavad misachad lachasho asiris. If for some reason you didn't manage all of that, and it's now you find yourself after Shua Asiris, it's beyond that time. Again, let's say it's late afternoon. After in London, for example, 3:07 p.m. It's 4 o'clock, 4:30. Adayin lo yochel sudas purim yochel af lachasho asiris. You should still eat after that time. Aval yochel barak ma'at lechem, but just only have a little bit of bread. So have a small amount of kazayas of bread or something, and a fairly small amount, so that it doesn't impact the Friday night meal. Now, do you have to have bread? What is the general rule when it comes to a Seuda on Purim? Do you have to have bread? So the Magen Avraham says in Tofresh Sadihei, I don't find the chiyuv to actually have bread. So you want to have other things, meats and vegetables or whatever it may be, and to have that and not to actually wash, says the Magen Avraham, that's actually okay. The Aruch HaShulchan takes issue with that. In the bottom box of the page, I see people query that. I feel that that's not correct, that you're not yotze your Purim Seuda if you don't wash. Dumya de Shabbos for Yontov. It's the same as Shabbos and Yontov. You've got to wash on Shabbos and Yontov. And furthermore, you can't call it a mishteh without bread. Because it says with light, vayas lohem mishteh umatzos ofa vayochlu. And they ate. So it's talking about washing and having bread or matzahs. So again, it's another pasuk referring to the fact that food, a proper meal, involves bread. So the Aruch HaShulchan takes issue with the Magen Avraham and says that one really should wash. Okay, turning over the sheet, the Aruch HaShulchan adds the following: Mitzvah laharbes besuda bepurim simcha umishteh, because it says in the pasuk in Esther in Perek Tes, it calls it Yemei Simcha Umishteh. V'keitzad chovas sudazu sheyochel basar. So do you actually have to have meat? So the Aruch HaShulchan says that you should have meat. Even this year, you're going to have it in the morning or late morning before Chatzos, ideally. Then, but you should still try and have meat. V'yisakein suda no'ek fi asher timtze yodoi kein kosovo Rambam. Umashma, so you're trying to have a meal which is according to one's financial means. Umashma de bosa vaday tzorich, and it's mashma that you do need meat. To biladai zeh ein chashivas. Without meat, it's not considered. It doesn't have the requisite importance and chashivas that is needed for a Purim Seuda. Now, the Magen Avraham says, interestingly, the reality is that come Shabbos, if person doesn't want to eat meat, he's entitled to do so. There's no chiyuv to have meat on Shabbos. To Purim Shani. Now the question is, what is the story with Purim? Do you have to have meat? Do you want to have a milchik Seuda? For example, this year Purim, it's tempting perhaps for some not to have a fleishik Seuda, a meaty Seuda, but to have brunch with parv and milchik things. So is that allowed? So the Magen Avram, so according to Aruch HaShulchan, it seems to say that from the Rambam that one should try and have meat. The Magen Avram says that on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you're not Yom Tov, Shabbos, there's no obligation to have basar, but Purim could be different. Why? Because it says about Purim, simcha, ve'in simcha ele b'basar, and therefore simcha always is associated with meat. That's a bit difficult. Because we know that Yom Tov, more than Shabbos, there is an Indian to have meat, and the Magen Avram says, according to the Magen Avram, the only obligation to eat meat is when the Beis Hamikdash is there, and we're talking about the basar of karbonos, and therefore nowadays on Yom Tov, according to the Magen Avram, there would be no obligation to have meat, and therefore kolshken on Purim, which is like sort of perhaps lower level than Yom Tov, also not. So that is debated by the Magen Avram. The Shevet HaLevi says, Mikol Makon Maskona, Gam Magen Avram, Noited Yesh In Simchas Basar Bein B'Yom Tov Bein B'Purim. But at the end of the day, the Magen Avram does conclude that it's preferred to have meat both on Yom Tov and on Purim. And the Pri Megadim actually says that is the conclusion of the Magen Avram, to have meat on Purim and on Yom Tov. The Gam B'Purim, I'll call upon him mitzvah ikka. Okay, and apparently Moshe Feinstein is cited as saying that chicken would suffice. It doesn't actually have to be regular meat, and chicken would suffice. Now, just to conclude, and then we'll summarize things, there is a concept of Poris Mapo Makadish. Let's just talk about that for a little bit. That means that a Friday, let's say your Purim Seuda is very labour-tic and a lot's going on, and it extends into the late afternoon, and you think to yourself, you know what? We can just continue this meal, and this will morph into the Shabbos meal. Are you allowed to do that? Well, that is called Poris Mapo Makadish, and let's talk about how that works. So the Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Reish Ayin Aleph Sif Dalet, also litem klum kodesh yikadesh. The general rule is you're not allowed to eat anything before Kiddush on Friday night. Afilu mayim. You come from shul on Friday night and you want a drink of water, you should wait until Kiddush. Even if you began the meal, that means you started the meal before Shabbos, and then Shabbos comes in, you should stop, because once Shabbos comes in, you can't eat anything more until you've made Kiddush. Shepeires mapo mekadesh literally means that you cover over the table or mekadesh, and then you make Kiddush. And if you're already drinking wine in the Seuda, as one should during the Purim Seuda, and you've already made your Be'er Gofen, you just make Kiddush, and you don't need to make the actual bracha of Be'er Gofen, because the bracha you made earlier will continue and will count. Now, so the question is, should one do that? Should one do that this Friday, start the meal, and it's a labour-tic, lengthy Seuda, which goes on until the afternoon? Should you just sort of morph it into the Shabbos meal and to just stand up as Shabbos comes in and make Kiddush? You don't need to make a Be'er Gofen if you've already made one, and then just continue eating, and that becomes the Shabbos meal. So the Piskei Tshuva says the following. Im Yirtze, look at this, is the penultimate box. Im Yirtze yuchel isbal mincha, one could daven mincha, v'achkach yitel yadov, and then you go and wash. You could then wash in the late afternoon after plug, or even later than plug, but so long as it's before Shkia. And then when Shkia, when sunset kicks in, you stop. You stop eating, and then you makabel Shabbos. V'yifres mapalapas, you cover over the bread with a chaladekel or with whatever. She'al hashulchan yekadesh al kos yayin. You make kiddush as one normally does on Friday night. V'im kva birach al yayin, and the Piskei Tshuva mentions what we said above, that if you already made a bracha of Be'er Gofen on wine, lo yivarach shuv beis hakiddush, you don't make another bracha again of Be'er Gofen. V'yochel shuv l'chol hapachas kazayis pas below birachas hamotzi, and then you just have at least a kazayis of bread after you've made kiddush, and then that becomes the Shabbos meal. Now, in Ha'ara 31 of the Piskei Tshuva, he says the following. Some people do this and say that lechatchila, you should do this. This is the ideal way of doing it. B'Sefer Minhagei Eretz Yisrael, he quotes various people, Shehu minag yafeh v'noim zui derech yashar v'cheinu minagenu b'ir kodesh v'shalayim, etc. V'Sefer Purim shechol b'Shabbos, maybe divrei ha'meiri in Ksubas, v'afanu avseinu nagim b'Purim shechol b'erev Shabbos, maschilin asud mibayidiyim at sheikadesh, etc., etc. So there are sources that he brings that suggest that it is a lechatchila, that is the ideal way of doing it. Omnom. B'Kaf HaChaim, however, in the Kaf HaChaim, the famous Sfardi Poisik, Kasu Delfi Divrei Ha'ari, B'Shar Kavonos Le'nochen Lasses Kein Le'Sorach Le'Kadish Dafka Achat V'Les Arvis. He says it's not a good idea to do it, and rather you should only do that, you should only make Kiddush after you've davened Ma'ariv, which is sort of practically, that's a little bit difficult. That means you're sort of stopping your Seuda, your Purim Seuda, at Shkia time, let's say. You then, let's say you've davened Mincha before the Seuda, and then you stop, and then you would daven Ma'ariv. That could happen, and then you would continue the meal then, because Ma'ariv would not be a hefsek to the meal if it's you don't have to, the meal continues. It's not mafsik it. I remember many years ago when I was in yeshiva in Yerushalayim, it was this sort of situation, and what we did was, it must have been Purim and Yudalid must have been on a Thursday, and Purim and Yerushalayim was on a Friday, and we did exactly that. We were Purim Mapurim Makadish, and the person I was with was a Talmud Chacham, and he did it properly. And we must have davened Mincha beforehand, and then you have the Seuda. We must have davened Mizmor Shir and or Kabbalah Shabbos around the table. Part of Purim Seuda was very geschmack, and that seems to work. So whilst the Piskei Teshuvos brings Poskim that say that it's a lechatchila, the Kaf HaChaim says it's not ideal because the Arizal says that you shouldn't really do this, you shouldn't really make Kiddush before you've davened Ma'ariv. And the Mishnah Berurah says at the bottom box, K'shechal Purim B'erev Shabbos, you've got another problem. Another problem is, what do you do when it comes to benching? Because you're benching now, it's well into Shabbos. So do you say Al Nissim or do you not say Al Nissim? Because you're saying Ritzei because it's now Shabbos, but Al Nissim is yesterday, it's Purim. So says the Mishnah Berurah, you should really mention Ritzei. How can you say Al Nissim? Says the Mishnah Berurah. It's a contradiction. You can't have it both. Al Nissim is referring to Purim, which is Friday, and Shabbos is Ritzei, which is the next day. The Kivin De'en Haskaras Al Nissim Chomer Kolkach, since the mentioning of Al Nissim is not as strict as Ritzei, Lochein Yom Raksha Shabbos. Therefore, the Mishnah Berurah concludes that if you do this Puris Mapim Makadish, Ritzei trumps, and you should say that over Al Nissim. V'chol Zeh Afilu K'Shlei Spal Adayin. That's only if you haven't davened yet. That's certainly if you haven't davened. Of Pratim Ispalel Mekodim, especially if you have davened, then for sure you don't say Al Nissim and benching. And that's generally for all years. That if you've davened Ma'ariv, your Seuda, it happens to us almost many years, most years. My father-in-law has yahrzeit on the day after Purim, so many times we would make sure to daven Ma'ariv at some point later in the Seuda. Let's say the Seuda starts at 4 o'clock on a regular year, and it goes on till, let's say, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. So at 8 p.m., he's anxious to daven Ma'ariv, and we would daven Ma'ariv with him, and whenever there's a minyan available and it's a good time. And we could still be in the middle of the Seuda. So in a situation like that, we daven Ma'ariv, then you don't say Al Nissim. So let me just summarize all the lots of things that we've said. We've said that when Purim falls on a Friday, as it does this year, for those outside of Yerushalayim, we have to, the minhag is to have the Seuda we'll have the Seuda early, before Chatzos. There we have to balance, on one hand, what the Shulchan Aruch says in Reish Mem Tes, the general prohibition not to eat too much on Erev Shabbos, which takes away from our appetite on Friday night. But when it falls on Friday, we have to balance enjoying the Mishteh as well. So the Ramah says that Yaseh Seuda b'Shachar is because of Kovod Shabbos. And therefore, Purim Seuda should start before Halachic midday, before Chatzos, which this year in London is 10 past 12. And if one missed that, then you should try and make sure that you have the Seuda before the Shah Siris, which is the beginning of the 10th hour, which again in London is 3:07 p.m. But even if you've missed that, but the Eved, you can be eaten all day. However, one should try and, if it's so late in the day, not to eat too much. If like the Piskei Teshuvos says, do you need to wash? So the Magen Avraham says not. However, the conclusion of the Aruch HaShulchan, most poskim, is that you should try and wash for the Purim Seuda. Do you actually have to have meat? So the Aruch HaShulchan quotes the Rambam, who says you do. And the conclusion, although the Magen Avraham debates it, most say that the conclusion of the Magen Avraham is that one should try to have meat. Moshe Feinstein is cited as saying that chicken on Purim suffices. And Puris Mapu Makadish can you sort of do that method of extending the Purim Seuda into the Friday night Seuda? So according to some, it's lechatchila, but so the consensus seems to be that it's not ideal, and therefore there are lots of different practical reasons why it's not ideal. Number one, the practicalities of davening. You've got to sort of make sure that you daven mincha beforehand. When do you actually daven mariv? There's the practicalities of that. You've got the issues of alanism and rutzei. The Mishnah Berurah does conclude that if it does happen, rutzei trumps, and certainly if you've daven mariv, then definitely rutzei trumps. And there's the concern of mixing of two simchas sort of conceptually, and therefore, although some people do it, I think mainstream practice is not to. Wishing everyone a freilich and Purim.